The rain tapped against the bedroom window as Ethan stepped inside, the subtle hum of tension in the air striking him before anything else. He had arrived home a day earlier than planned, eager for a warm embrace, but the sight before him froze him in place. A sleek, foreign sports car sat parked in the driveway, its engine still warm, giving off faint wisps of heat in the damp night air. Inside, the dimly lit bedroom painted a more unsettling picture. Camille, his wife, sat on the edge of the bed, her hair tousled, her clothes rumpled in a way that told a story Ethan hadn't prepared himself to confront. Draped over the back of a chair by the window was an unfamiliar suit jacket, expensive, tailored, and most certainly not his. Every detail felt meticulously placed, like a cruel tableau of betrayal, laid out solely for him. Ethan's voice cut through the stillness, low and controlled. Care to explain? Camille turned to him, an expression of casual indifference settling over her face. The smallest flicker of guilt or remorse would have given him some hope to cling to, but she offered none. Instead, she sighed and met his gaze with a glint of defiance. Why does it matter? Her voice held a chilling finality, as if the question itself was absurd. Something in Ethan broke at that moment, a quiet, calm part of him that had hoped, against all reason, for an explanation that might make sense of the chaos. But the flicker of sarcasm in her words stirred something far colder than heartbreak. For the first time, Ethan felt himself shift from desperate longing to a steely resolve, understanding that this confrontation would not unfold as she expected. Ethan took a slow breath, his eyes drifting from the suit jacket to Camille, then to the unmade bed. The silence between them thickened, stretching out like an invisible weight pressing on his chest. Every detail felt wrong, like he was witnessing a life that wasn't his own, a stranger's nightmare. But it was his, and there was no waking up from it. You know, he said finally, his voice unnervingly calm, I came home early because I thought you might miss me. Guess I miscalculated. He kept his gaze on her, waiting for any flicker of regret, any sign that the woman he married might still be in there somewhere. But Camille's face remained impassive, her only response a half smile that seemed more mocking than anything else. I didn't ask you to come back, she replied smoothly, folding her arms across her chest. It's not like we've been happy for a long time, is it? Ethan felt the words cut through him, but he stayed rooted, determined not to let her see him flinch. If you were unhappy, you could have said something. You could have been honest. This, he gestured toward the stranger's belongings scattered across their bedroom. This was never the answer. She shrugged, glancing away as if bored by the conversation. Maybe you're just not the man I thought you were. The cruelty of her words sent a surge of anger rushing up his spine, but he kept it in check, unwilling to give her the satisfaction of seeing him unravel. He could feel his control slipping, though, the same control he'd clung to for years as their marriage gradually frayed. He'd ignored the late nights, the phone turned face down on the table, the laughter she'd shared with others, but not him. He'd buried his suspicions beneath layers of trust and hope, but all of it now felt like an elaborate trap, and he was the fool who had walked right into it. Camille's gaze shifted back to him, her expression cold, calculating. Are you done? She asked, arching an eyebrow. I don't owe you an apology, Ethan. With him, she hesitated just long enough to let him feel the weight of her words before continuing. With him, I finally feel like myself. Ethan's hand tightened into a fist at his side, the anger bubbling over, but he knew better than to lash out. He forced himself to let the wave of pain pass, replacing it with something sharper clarity. He was done asking for answers, done hoping for any hint of remorse. Her indifference told him everything he needed to know. You're right, Camille, he said quietly, a calmness settling over him that even he didn't expect. I'm not the man you thought I was. And you're not the woman I thought I married. He took a step back, the smallest gesture of distance, but it felt like a gulf opening between them. I'll be out of here tonight. You can have the house, the memories, whatever they're worth to you. For a moment, something flickered in Camille's eyes, but it disappeared as quickly as it came, replaced by that same cold indifference. Fine, she said, barely glancing at him. If that's what you want. Ethan nodded slowly, feeling a strange sense of relief wash over him. He knew she expected him to break down, to fight, to cling to the shreds of their broken life. But he was beyond that now. His voice steady, he added, when you look back, remember this wasn't my choice. You're the one who ended it, Camille. And I hope whatever you were looking for with him was worth everything you lost tonight. Without another word, he turned, letting the silence of the room fill in what he left unsaid. The rain had softened to a drizzle, casting a somber grey light as he grabbed his coat, feeling strangely liberated as he crossed the threshold of the life he was leaving behind. Ethan's footsteps echoed in the quiet hallway as he made his way downstairs, each step feeling like he was walking out of the past and into a future he couldn't yet see. Outside, the rain had eased, leaving the driveway glistening under the porch light. He glanced back at the sleek car parked near the curb, its license plate obscured by droplets, its presence both foreign and infuriating. For a moment, he considered going back up and demanding to see the man who had been bold enough to occupy his home, his bed, and his wife's attention. He wanted a face to blame, a target for the anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. But as his fingers brushed the door handle, he knew it wouldn't make a difference. Camille's indifference had already told him everything he needed to know. Bringing another man into their home, letting him leave his suit jacket draped over their furniture, it was Camille's way of declaring him a stranger in his own life. No confrontation could erase the humiliation she'd chosen to leave behind so blatantly. He stepped out onto the porch, pulling the door closed behind him with a finality that surprised even him. The weight of his keys felt unfamiliar in his hand, and he turned them over slowly, studying the house, a place he'd once filled with hope and plans for a future that now seemed as foreign as the car parked outside. An idea flickered in his mind, subtle at first, then sharper. His keys dangled from his fingers as he felt a bitter smile form. If Camille had intended to humiliate him, he would return the gesture in his own way, a quiet, lasting reminder that she hadn't just betrayed him, she had misjudged him. Ethan reached for his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the name of an old college friend who worked in real estate. He tapped the number and listened to the ring, the decision settling over him like armor. After a few rings, his friend's familiar voice answered, groggy and half asleep. "Hey, Ethan, you okay? It's late?" "Hey, Tony. I know, sorry to bother you, but I need a favor. Think you could find me a place to stay somewhere temporary, maybe just for a month?" There was a pause, then a cautious laugh. "Temporary? You're not ditching that dream house of yours, are you?" Ethan felt a pang, but he kept his voice steady. "Something like that. Let's just say Camille's got other priorities." A heavy silence lingered between them as Tony picked up on the gravity of Ethan's words. "All right, man. I'll help you out. Let me pull some strings, and I'll get back to you tomorrow." "Thanks," Ethan replied, feeling a knot loosen in his chest. "And one more thing, I want to put the house on the market. Quietly for now. I want it handled quickly." "You sure about this?" "Yeah, I'm sure." As he hung up, the rain began again, softly drumming against the roof. Ethan stood on the porch for a moment, watching the drops gather and slide down the stranger's car. He could almost picture Camille looking out from the bedroom, wondering if he'd really go through with it, if he'd actually leave her behind without a fight. He felt a sense of satisfaction imagining her realization that she was no longer in control of this story, that he was done playing the part she'd assigned him. He turned his back on the house and started down the driveway, each step feeling lighter than the last. He would pack the essentials tonight, tie up the loose ends, and leave the rest for her to sort through in the morning. By the time the sun rose, he would be gone, taking with him only what he needed to start fresh. Camille could have the shell of their life together, he wanted nothing more to do with it. As he reached his car, he paused, taking a final look at the house. Shadows danced across the windows, the dim glow of the bedroom light faintly visible. There was a quiet sense of finality in the sight. He opened the car door, settled into the seat, and took a deep breath, letting the past roll off him like the raindrops on the windshield. His finger hovered over the ignition, the engine waiting for his signal to move forward. With one last look at the life he was leaving, he turned the key and drove off into the night. Ethan drove through the quiet streets, the rhythmic hum of the engine lulling his thoughts into a haze. Streetlights cast pools of pale light on the wet pavement, and he watched them pass in a blur, each one pulling him farther from the life he was leaving behind. The anger that had burned so fiercely only moments ago began to settle, leaving a strange emptiness in its place. He wondered if this hollow feeling was what Camille had meant by not feeling complete. In the silence of the car, memories began to creep in, small moments he'd ignored, explanations that hadn't quite fit, but that he'd pushed aside, telling himself he was being paranoid. There had been dinners she'd claimed to work late for, weekends spent out with friends he'd never met, little lies he hadn't wanted to question too closely. He thought he'd been protecting their marriage by trusting her, by not prying into things she kept private. But now he realized that trust had been his biggest mistake. He had offered it to her so freely, assuming she valued it the way he did. Ethan felt the bitterness rising again and gripped the wheel tighter. But instead of trying to fight it, he let the anger settle. It was easier than feeling the sadness he knew lurked just beneath it. His phone buzzed beside him, pulling him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. Tony. He hit the speaker button, a quiet relief in hearing a friendly voice on the other end. "Ethan, I didn't expect you to pick up," Tony said, his tone cautious. "Listen, I found a place. Not far from downtown. It's simple, but it's available immediately. You can move in tonight if you want." Ethan let out a slow breath, feeling a strange sense of gratitude. "That's perfect, Tony. I'll take it." Tony hesitated, then added, "Look, man, I don't know the whole story, but whatever happened, I'm here. You don't have to handle this on your own." A lump formed in Ethan's throat. He hadn't realized until that moment just how isolated he felt, how much he'd been internalizing, not letting anyone see the cracks forming in his life. "Thanks, Tony, I appreciate it," he managed, his voice rough. "I'll be fine, though. I just need to get through tonight." "All right, I'll text you the address and tell the property manager you'll be by in an hour. Thanks again." Ethan ended the call, his fingers resting on the steering wheel as he sat there, watching the rain bead on the windshield. In a strange way, the prospect of a quiet, empty apartment felt like a relief. There would be no remnants of Camille there, no lingering reminders of what he'd lost, just silence, a blank slate. As he resumed driving, Ethan realized he didn't feel like going straight to his new place. The need for closure tugged at him, a desire to take control of his story, rather than let Camille's betrayal define it. He turned off the main road, heading toward the quiet park where he and Camille had shared their first date. The place was deserted, the swings swaying gently in the night breeze, the damp grass glistening in the moonlight. Ethan parked, stepping out into the cool air. He walked to the bench where they'd once sat, sharing laughter and secrets that had seemed so genuine at the time. He stared at the spot where she had first leaned into him, her head on his shoulder, her eyes bright with excitement for a future he'd thought they both wanted. For a long time he stood there, letting the memories wash over him, each one a reminder of how much he had been willing to give for a woman who had let go of him long before tonight. At last, he took out his phone, opening his text messages. His fingers hovered over Camille's contact, but instead of writing something angry or desperate, he typed 3 short words, "I hope it was worth it." He sent the message and then deleted her contact entirely. The act felt final, like letting go of a weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. He returned to his car, feeling lighter, as though a piece of him that had been tethered to the past was finally free. As he drove away from the park, Ethan felt a small flicker of hope beneath the sorrow. It wasn't the life he had planned, but it was his again, unburdened, open, waiting for whatever he chose to build next. And with that thought, he left the past behind him, driving into the promise of a new beginning. The hours stretched into early morning as Ethan drove aimlessly through the quiet city, his mind still circling around what he'd just left behind. The streets were deserted, the occasional glow of a traffic light or the flicker of a neon sign the only things breaking the darkness. For a moment he felt untethered, his old life already beginning to feel like a fading dream. He knew he would have to face the reality of his new life eventually, but tonight was different. Tonight he could just exist in this in-between, a place where nothing was certain and nothing was decided. After some time, he pulled into an all-night diner, a familiar place he hadn't visited in years. It was a little worn around the edges, with faded red booths and a cracked linoleum floor, but it felt oddly comforting. He slid into a booth by the window and ordered a coffee. The waitress brought it over with a tired smile, a faint look of recognition in her eyes. Ethan nodded back, not sure if she remembered him from years ago or just saw someone else who looked like he needed a break from the world. As he sipped the coffee, he found himself reflecting on all the years he and Camille had spent together, wondering when things had started to unravel. Had he missed the signs, ignored the subtle shifts that hinted she was already drifting away from him? He thought back to their first apartment, a small but cozy place they could barely afford, and to the late nights spent talking about their dreams for the future. Back then, they'd felt like they were on the same team, facing the world together. But somewhere along the way, those shared dreams had become his alone. It dawned on him that he'd held onto an idea of Camille that had probably stopped being real a long time ago. In his mind, she'd always been his partner, his confidant, someone who cared as deeply about their life together as he did. But he was finally beginning to understand that the woman he'd loved was more an image he'd built than a reality she had ever lived up to. It was a painful realization, but there was a strange comfort in it, to a sense that he hadn't been as blind as he'd thought. He'd simply been committed in a way she wasn't. The door of the diner chimed, pulling Ethan from his thoughts. A man in a worn coat came in and nodded to him, taking a seat at the counter. The normalcy of it, the man, the waitress pouring coffee, the low hum of the radio playing a forgotten love song, reminded Ethan that life went on. There would be mornings, coffee, and conversation waiting for him somewhere, just not with Camille. Not anymore. He pulled out his phone again, staring at the blank screen. Tony's message was still open, the address of his new apartment waiting for him. With a sense of purpose he hadn't felt all night, he texted back a simple, "I'll be there soon. Thanks for everything." He pocketed the phone, finished his coffee, and left a few bills on the table. The drive to his new apartment was shorter than he'd expected, and as he pulled into the quiet complex, he found himself eyeing the modest building with a sense of anticipation. It wasn't much a small, one-bedroom unit on the third floor, but it was his. For the first time in years he felt a faint spark of excitement at the thought of starting over, free from the weight of Camille's indifference and betrayal. The apartment was as bare as he'd imagined, a blank slate with neutral walls and minimal furniture, a bed, a table, a small sofa. Setting down his single suitcase, he took a deep breath, letting the stillness settle over him. He could hear the faint murmur of a television through the wall, the hum of the fridge, and the drip of a faucet in the bathroom. It wasn't much, but it was quiet and his. He opened the suitcase, pulling out a few clothes and setting them in the empty closet. He found himself smiling at the smallness of it, all just a handful of essentials he'd thrown together on a whim. Everything else he'd left behind, the remnants of a life he no longer wanted. He set up his phone charger on the nightstand, plugged in the charger, and then sat on the edge of the bed, letting out a long sigh. He had no plans, no expectations, just the simple idea of taking things one day at a time. He knew he wasn't ready to think about the future yet, not in any real way. But there was something about the emptiness of the apartment, the lack of history here, that felt like a gift. It was a chance to build something new, to redefine his life on his own terms. Before he could overthink it, he opened his phone and deleted the photos he'd saved of him and Camille, erasing the last traces of their time together. There was no ceremony to it, no bittersweet final look, just a quiet sense of release, of letting go of someone who had already let go of him. As he set the phone down, Ethan lay back on the bed, staring up at the ceiling. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, and he could see the faint glow of streetlights through the curtains. For the first time since he'd walked into that room and found Camille's betrayal laid bare, he felt at peace. There would be a time for anger, a time to grieve, but right now there was only calm. The world outside felt quiet and unhurried, as if it had granted him this night to simply exist, to feel the weight of his decisions without judgment. He didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. And as he drifted into sleep, Ethan knew that when he woke up, he would begin again, this time on his own terms.